A sharply dressed man strode confidently into the most upscale jewelry store in Seattle. In his hands, he carried the intention of finding the perfect engagement ring for his young girlfriend. But when the saleswoman looked up, time froze. Those were eyes he hadn't seen in 40 years. Eyes that held a secret capable of unraveling everything he'd planned. Before we find out what happens next, leave a comment here if you are watching this story on TV or your cell phone, and like the video to continue following along. James adjusted his blazer, feeling the weight of the moment as he pushed open the glass door of the finest jewelry store in downtown Seattle. The soft chime of a bell announced his arrival, and the cool air, laced with the faint scent of polished wood and precious metals, enveloped him like a distant memory. It was a crisp autumn afternoon, and the golden light streaming through the tall windows danced across displays of diamonds, emeralds, and sapphires, each gem catching the glow as if holding secrets of its own. He had rehearsed this moment for weeks, selecting the perfect ring for Lauren, his 30-year-old girlfriend, the woman who had brought lightness to his life over the past 2 years. At 58, James was determined to start anew, to seal a commitment he believed would erase the shadows of a life marked by tough choices. His eyes scanned the room, taking in the refined details, the polished marble floors, the sleek walnut display cases, the chandeliers sparkling like miniature galaxies. He was a successful businessman, accustomed to negotiating multi-million-dollar deals and commanding boardrooms with cool precision. But here, faced with the promise of a future with Lauren, a woman nearly 30 years his junior, he felt almost exposed, as if the weight of a single ring could carry the fate of an entire life. He approached the main counter, where a woman with silver hair swept into an elegant updo was arranging a tray of earrings with meticulous care. Something about her posture, the gentle curve of her shoulders, made his chest tighten before he even saw her face. When she lifted her gaze, James's world stopped. Time, which he had mastered with calendars and Rolex watches, collapsed in an instant. Those hazel eyes, deep as a Pacific Northwest rainstorm, were unmistakable. Margaret, his first love, from when he was 18. The woman he had loved with the intensity of someone yet to be scarred by the world. The woman he had left behind 40 years ago, when ambition to build a career in New York had blinded him to everything else. His heart raced, a frantic drumbeat echoing in his ears. He opened his mouth to speak, but the words dissolved, leaving only an awkward silence between them. Margaret studied him for a moment that felt eternal. Her lips pressed into a thin line, but she quickly composed herself, adopting a flawless mask of professionalism. "Good afternoon, sir," she said, her voice calm, almost melodic, but with a slight quiver that only someone who knew her deeply would notice. "Can I help you find something special?" She gestured toward the rings displayed on the counter, each one gleaming brighter than the last, as if they were promises of a future James suddenly wasn't sure he wanted. He cleared his throat, trying to regain control. "Yes, I'm looking for an engagement ring," he managed, his voice hoarse as if each word were pulled from a place he'd locked away decades ago. His eyes couldn't leave her. Margaret was different, of course. Time had etched fine lines across her face, but her beauty remained, now tempered by a dignity he didn't recall from their youth. Her silver hair shone under the lights, and the tailored navy dress she wore accentuated the natural grace of her movements. He wondered fleetingly how life had treated her, and then, with a pang, he remembered what he had done. Margaret nodded, as if his request hadn't shaken her. "An engagement ring is a significant choice," she said, pulling out a black velvet tray studded with diamonds that seemed to capture the sunlight. "Something classic, perhaps? Or do you prefer something more modern for your fiancé?" The word fiancé carried a slight pause, just enough to make James swallow hard. He realized she knew who he was. There was no mistaking it. Those eyes which had once gazed at him with love now assessed him with a mix of coolness and something he couldn't quite read. Pain? Resentment? Curiosity? "Classic," he replied, almost on autopilot, trying to anchor himself in reason. "Lauren likes things simple but elegant." He said her name like a lifeline, a reminder of why he was there. Lauren, with her easy smile and youthful energy, was the future. Margaret was the past. A past he had buried, or at least tried to, in some dark corner of his soul. Margaret tilted her head, as if evaluating not just his request, but James himself. "Simple, but elegant," she repeated, her faint smile not reaching her eyes. She picked up a ring with a single diamond, holding it delicately between her fingers, as if it were something fragile. "This is one of our most popular choices. The diamond is flawless, hand-cut. They say it symbolizes eternal love." The last sentence hung in the air, heavy with a weight that made James look away. A flush crept up his neck. He wanted to say something, to explain, to justify what he'd done 40 years ago. But how? How could he explain that at 18 he'd been a scared kid, seduced by promises of success in New York, unable to handle the responsibility of a serious relationship? How could he admit that for years he'd convinced himself Margaret was better off without him? The words formed in his mind but died before reaching his lips. Instead, he nodded, feigning interest in the ring. Margaret continued to show other options, each accompanied by a technical description that seemed designed to fill the silence between them. "This is an emerald cut, very sophisticated, and this one, with rose gold accents, is perfect for someone looking for something unique." Her hands moved with grace, but James noticed a slight tremble as she adjusted a ring in the display. He wanted to reach out, to touch those hands as he had so many times in their youth, but the distance between them was more than physical. It was a chasm of 40 years filled with choices and silences. "You been working here long?" he asked, a clumsy attempt to start a conversation, to maybe open a crack for something more. He needed to know, needed to understand who this woman was now, what she'd become after all this time. Margaret raised an eyebrow, and for a moment her professional mask slipped, revealing a flash of sarcasm. "Let's just say I know the business well," she replied, her vagueness only fueling James's curiosity. She wasn't just a salesperson, he could sense it. There was an authority in her demeanor, a confidence that went beyond what he'd expect from an employee. He wanted to ask more, but something in her gaze stopped him. It was as if she dared him to dig deeper, knowing he wasn't ready for what he'd find. The bell chimed again, signaling another customer's arrival. A young couple entered, laughing and exchanging affectionate glances. Margaret turned to them briefly, greeting them with a warm smile James hadn't received. He felt a stab of jealousy, so unexpected it caught him off guard. Why did it matter? Why, after 40 years, did her presence still unsettle him so much? "I'll need some time to decide," he said abruptly, feeling the weight of her gaze. Too many options. It was a weak excuse, and they both knew it. He wasn't here just to pick a ring anymore. He was here to confront a past he'd been running from his entire life. Margaret nodded, gathering the tray with a slow, almost ceremonial motion. "Of course, sir. I'll be here when you're ready." The formality of her words cut like a blade, but there was something in her tone, a veiled promise that made James shiver. She knew he'd be back, and deep down, he knew it too. He left the store empty-handed, his heart racing, his mind in chaos. The chilly Seattle air hit him like a slap, but it wasn't enough to clear his thoughts. Who was Margaret now? What had happened to her after he left? And above all, what was she hiding behind those eyes that seemed to hold 40 years of secrets? As he walked to his car, James felt something he hadn't in decades, the weight of regret that might be too late to mend. Or was it? The sky was painted with hues of orange and purple as James parked in front of his sleek downtown condo, its glass facade reflecting the city like a mirror of his own achievements. He turned off the engine but didn't get out right away. He sat there, hands gripping the steering wheel, staring at the darkening horizon. The jewelry store, with its glittering chandeliers and the weight of seeing Margaret again, felt like a dream now. But the unease lingered, a stone lodged in his chest. He'd walked in there certain of a future with Lauren, but he'd left with the past clinging to his shoulders, whispering questions he couldn't answer. Inside the condo, Lauren was waiting, as always, with a smile that lit up the room. The open-plan living space, with its minimalist furniture and neutral tones, exuded the comfort of a life he'd carefully built. Lauren, her chestnut hair loose over her shoulders, wore a flowy dress that swayed with her movements as she prepared dinner in the kitchen. The scent of rosemary and garlic filled the air, mingling with the soft hum of a song she was singing. "You're late, love," she said, turning with a glass of wine in hand. Did you find what you were looking for? Her question was light, almost playful, but it landed on James like a thunderbolt. He forced a smile, setting his leather briefcase on the couch. Not yet. Too many choices, you know. I want something really special. The words sounded brittle, and he saw Lauren's brow furrow, picking up on something in his voice that hadn't been there before. She set the glass on the coffee table and touched his arm gently, a gesture that would have soothed him on any other day. You okay? You seem off. James looked away, pretending to adjust his watch. How could he explain the storm raging inside him? How could he tell her that this afternoon he'd run into the woman he'd loved at 18, the woman he'd abandoned for his dreams? Just tired, he lied, feeling the weight of the falsehood in every syllable. He sat at the dining table as Lauren served dinner, chatting animatedly about her day, their weekend plans and the trip they'd take to the San Juan Islands. But James barely heard her. His mind was stuck in the jewelry store, in Margaret's hazel eyes, in the way she'd held that diamond ring as if offering him not just a jewel, but a mirror of his own choices. He remembered the tremor in her hands, the veiled sarcasm in her voice. "Let's just say I know the business well," she'd said. What did that mean? Who was Margaret now? And more importantly, what had happened in the years they'd been apart? The night wore on, and James found himself unable to keep up with the conversation. Lauren, ever perceptive, stopped talking and studied him with a mix of concern and curiosity. "James, what's going on? This isn't you. Talk to me." Her voice was gentle but firm, demanding a truth he wasn't ready to give. He looked at her, at those eyes full of trust, and felt a pang of guilt. Lauren didn't deserve his hesitation. She was young, vibrant, full of dreams he sometimes struggled to keep up with at 58. But tonight, he couldn't connect with her. Not when Margaret's image, with her steely composure and silent pain, dominated his thoughts. "It's just work," he said, standing up from the table. "I'm going to take a shower and rest. Long day." Lauren watched him go, but she didn't press. He knew she sensed the distance, the cracks in the facade he was trying to maintain. And that terrified him, because for the first time in 2 years, James wasn't sure he wanted the future he'd planned with her. The next day, he returned to the jewelry store. He wasn't sure why. Maybe it was the need for answers, maybe the urge to ease the weight he'd carried since seeing Margaret again. The bell chimed as he pushed the door open, and the same scent of polish and metal greeted him. Margaret was behind the counter, speaking with a younger employee. She wore a tailored grey suit that highlighted her impeccable posture, her silver hair gleaming under the chandeliers. When she saw him, she paused the conversation and dismissed the employee with a subtle nod. "Good afternoon, Mr. James," she said, her formal tone cutting like a knife. "Here to pick out that ring, I presume." He hesitated, feeling the weight of her gaze. "Yes, but I also came to talk." The words slipped out before he could stop them, and he realized with a mix of relief and dread that he couldn't run anymore. Margaret raised an eyebrow, but didn't respond right away. Instead, she motioned for him to approach the counter, where a new tray of rings was already laid out, as if she'd known he'd return. "These are some of our finest pieces," she began, pointing to a ring with a diamond that seemed to capture the entire room's light. "For your fiancé, something like this would be kind of special." The word special carried a weight, and James's stomach churned. He looked at her, searching for the 18-year-old girl he'd known, the one who laughed under the cherry blossoms in Volunteer Park, dreaming of a simple life together. But that girl was gone. In her place was a woman, strong and elegant, but shadowed by a pain he knew he'd caused. "Margaret, He stopped, swallowing hard. "I didn't expect to find you. Not here, not like this." She stayed silent, her fingers hovering over the ring, as if waiting for him to continue. And he did, because there was no turning back. "I know what I did was unforgivable. I was young, stupid, but I never stopped thinking about you, I swear." The last word came out as a whisper, and he saw her eyes narrow as if he'd touched a still raw wound. 40 years, James," she said at last, her voice low but steady. 40 years. Did you know I raised a son on my own? While you were building your empire, your deals, your dreams, I was scrubbing floors, sewing late into the night, doing whatever it took to give him a chance. She paused, her eyes glistening with tears. she refused to let fall. "And now you walk in here looking for a ring for another woman, saying you swear you thought of me, as if a single sentence could erase the past." James felt the floor drop out from under him. "Son." She'd said, "son." He'd always suspected deep down, but had pretended not to know. Hearing it aloud was like a punch to the gut. He wanted to ask his name, his age, what had happened, but Margaret's words froze him. "You own this place, don't you?" he asked, almost without thinking, desperate to shift the conversation but also to understand who she'd become. Margaret smiled, a bitter curve that didn't reach her eyes. "Yes, James. I own it. Built it from nothing with my own hands. While you were in New York, living your life, closing your deals, I learned to turn pain into diamonds." She gestured to the store, its gleaming displays and attentive staff. "Every gem here has a story. And mine is made of sacrifice." He opened his mouth to reply, but she cut him off, raising a hand. "You want a ring for your fiancé? Pick one. But don't expect me to pretend those 40 years didn't happen." She picked up the solitaire diamond ring and held it out to him, her eyes blazing with an intensity that made him step back. "This one's perfect. Pure. Flawless. Like the love you think you found. But be careful, James. Diamonds are forever. But promises can break." He stood silent, her words crushing him. He wanted to beg for forgiveness, to fall to his knees, to promise to fix everything. But how? How do you fix a lifetime of absence? He looked at the ring, but all he saw was the reflection of his own mistakes. "I don't know how to start apologizing," he said finally, his voice breaking. "But I want to try. Please, Margaret, tell me how." She stared at him for a long moment, and he saw for the first time a crack in her armor. A tear escaped, tracing a slow path down her cheek, shining like the diamonds she sold. "You want to know how?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "Start with him, our son, but don't expect it to be easy, James. The truth is a weight not everyone can carry." She turned away, as if she couldn't bear his presence any longer, and began organizing the tray, her movements precise but heavy with emotion. James stood frozen, his heart pounding, his mind swirling with questions. Who was this son? What was he like? What had Margaret told him about his father? And above all, was there room, after all these years, for redemption? He left the store once again without a ring, but with something far heavier, the certainty that his carefully planned life was about to collapse. And deep down, he knew he deserved it. The morning dawned grey, with heavy clouds mirroring the turmoil in James's soul. He sat in his office, a spacious corner suite with a view of Puget Sound, where contracts and numbers had always grounded him. But that morning, the stacks of papers on his mahogany desk felt meaningless. Margaret's words echoed in his mind, each syllable laced with a truth he'd avoided for 40 years. "I raised our son alone." He held a pen, twirling it between his fingers, but couldn't focus. The image of her face, with that lone tear glistening like a diamond, was all he could see. And the mention of their son, our son, was an open wound, a void he'd never let himself face. James dropped the pen and leaned back in his chair, the leather creaking under his weight. He'd built a life of success, a thriving company, an impeccable reputation, a girlfriend who made him feel young again. But now it all seemed like a facade, a house of cards ready to fall. He opened his desk drawer and pulled out a small frame, one he rarely looked at. It was an old photo, faded by time, from when he was 18. He and Margaret smiling under a tree in Pike Place Market, their faces lit with a happiness that seemed invincible. He'd kept that photo all these years, a secret even his closest confidants didn't know. Why had he held on to it? He wasn't sure. Maybe a reminder of what could have been, or a silent punishment for his choices. His phone rang, pulling him from his thoughts. It was Lauren, her cheerful voice on the other end. "Hey babe, you had breakfast yet? I was thinking of swinging by for lunch. We could hit that place by the waterfront you love." Her energy was like a ray of sunshine, but for the first time, James felt he didn't deserve its warmth. He mumbled an excuse, saying he was swamped with work and promised to call later. When he hung up, the office's silence felt heavier. He knew he was delaying the inevitable. Lauren deserved the truth, but how could he tell her something he barely understood himself? That afternoon, James returned to the jewelry store. The bell chimed, but the sound, once welcoming, now felt like a warning. Margaret was there, as if fate had placed her exactly where he needed her to be. She was discussing a pearl necklace with a customer, her grace unchanged from decades ago. When the customer left, she turned to him, her eyes narrowing briefly before regaining composure. "Back again, James?" she asked, her tone a mix of exhaustion and defiance. "Still haven't found the perfect ring? Feel free to try another store." He took a deep breath, feeling the air catch in his throat. "I didn't come for the ring," he said, his voice steady but thick with emotion. "I came for you, for our son." The words came out like a confession, and he saw her body stiffen, as if he'd crossed an invisible line. Margaret crossed her arms almost defensively and stared at him with an intensity that made him want to retreat. But he didn't. Not this time. "You don't have the right to talk about him," she said, her voice low but sharp as a blade. "You gave that up when you boarded that plane to New York, when you left me alone with a child to raise." She paused, and James saw the effort it took to keep her voice steady. "Do you know what it's like to wake up every day knowing the man you love chose the world over you? To look into a boy's eyes and make up stories to explain why his father never came?" James felt his chest tighten, as if an invisible hand were crushing it. He wanted to protest, to say he'd had no choice, that his family and circumstances had pressured him, but he knew those were flimsy excuses. Instead, he asked, almost whispering, "What's his name?" It was the first time he'd voiced the question aloud, and its weight surprised him. He needed to know, needed a name for the void that haunted him. Margaret hesitated, her eyes shimmering with a mix of anger and pain. For a moment he thought she wouldn't answer, but then she spoke, her voice barely audible. "Nathan. His name is Nathan." The name hit James like a wave, bringing memories of nights when he and Margaret dreamed of the future, picking names for the children they'd have. Nathan had been one of her choices, and now that name belonged to a 39-year-old man, a man he'd never met. "He's a doctor," Margaret continued, as if compelled to fill the silence. "A cardiologist, one of the best in Seattle. He graduated with honors, got married, has 2 kids. My grandkids." She reached into her purse on the counter and pulled out her phone, showing James a photo. It was Nathan, a man with strong features and eyes like Margaret's, holding 2 young children, one in each arm. He smiled in the photo, a smile that carried his mother's strength. James felt his eyes burn, and a tear escaped before he could stop it. "He's beautiful," he murmured, his voice breaking. "And the grandkids. I have grandkids." The word felt foreign, almost unreal. He was a grandfather, and he'd never known. He looked at Margaret, searching her face for something. Maybe an opening, a sign she might forgive him. But what he saw was a woman who had carried the world alone, a woman who didn't need him, but still bore the pain of his absence. "I worked as a cleaner, James," she said, her voice gaining strength. "Scrubbing houses, offices, anything that paid enough for milk and diapers. At night, I sewed for clients, took odd jobs, studied while Nathan slept. And when he grew up, when he started asking about you, I told him you were dead." She paused, her eyes locked on his. "It was easier than explaining you abandoned us, easier than seeing the disappointment in his eyes." James felt the ground shake beneath him. Dead. To Nathan, he was a ghost, a story that never existed. He wanted to argue, to say he hadn't had a choice, but he knew those were hollow words. "I didn't know how to come back," he admitted, his voice broken. I thought you'd be better off without me." Margaret laughed, a short, bitter sound. "Better off? You think it was easy? You think building all this—" She gestured to the store, its gleaming displays. "Was easy? I fought every day of my life to give Nathan what you wouldn't. And now you show up wanting to know about him, as if you have the right to walk into his life out of nowhere." "I don't want to disrupt anything," James said, his hands raised, pleading. "I just want to meet him, to ask for forgiveness. Please, Margaret, let me try." He saw the hesitation in her eyes, the conflict between the pain she carried and something else, hope, fear, or just exhaustion. Margaret took a deep breath, as if weighing every word she'd say next. "I don't know if I'm ready to tell him," she said, her voice almost a whisper. "He's built a life, James. A good one. and I won't let you tear it apart." She turned, picking up a cloth to polish a display case, as if she needed something to occupy her hands. "Come back when you know what you really want, but don't expect me to make it easy for you." James stood frozen, his heart pounding, his mind a whirlwind of emotions. He wanted to push, to beg, but he knew she was right. He had no right to demand anything. Still, the image of Nathan, a man he'd never met, and the grandchildren who carried his blood, burned in his mind. He left the store with a new resolve. He had to find Nathan, had to somehow make peace with the past. But how, and at what cost? The twilight settled over Seattle, painting the condo's windows with an orange glow that seemed to mock the darkness growing in James's chest. He sat on the couch, the same one where days earlier Lauren had left her bag while preparing dinner, with a smile that now felt distant. The silence was broken only by the ticking of a wall clock, each second marking the weight of a decision he knew he had to make. Nathan's image, smiling in the photo with his children, mixed with Margaret's strength and pain, and Lauren's betrayed trust. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Margaret's face, heard her words. "I told him you were dead." And he saw Nathan, a stranger with his blood, living a life he'd never been part of. Lauren walked into the living room holding a mug of chamomile tea, its scent drifting through the air. She wore a light sweater, her hair in a messy bun that made her look even younger. "You're quiet again," she said, sitting beside him. Her voice was soft, but her eyes held a growing concern, a glint of doubt. "Is it work? Or something else?" She tilted her head, trying to catch his gaze, but James looked away, staring at the darkening skyline beyond the window. "It's complicated," he murmured, the words heavy, each one carrying the burden of 40 years. He wanted to tell her everything, about Margaret, Nathan, the grandchildren he'd never known. But how could he explain something he was still grappling with? How could he tell the woman he planned to propose to that his heart was tangled in a past he'd abandoned? Lauren deserved more than half-truths, but James lacked the strength to offer the whole truth. Not yet. "Complicated how?" she pressed, setting the mug on the coffee table with a firm but gentle motion. "James, I know you. This isn't you. Tell me." Her sincerity cut through the defenses he'd built. He looked at her, at the face that had been his refuge for 2 years, and felt a wave of guilt. Lauren was everything he'd dreamed of for a fresh start. Young, vibrant, full of life. But now, he wondered if that dream was truly his, or just an escape from the void Margaret had left. "I ran into someone from my past," he said finally, his voice rough, the words torn from his soul. Lauren's brow furrowed, her body tensing slightly. "Someone important?" she asked, her tone laced with a curiosity that masked fear. James hesitated, his heart racing. He could stop there, say it was nothing, a fleeting memory. But Nathan's image burned in his mind. "Very important," he admitted, gripping his knees. "Margaret. She was my first love, 40 years ago. And I left her." He paused, swallowing hard. "I left her and she was pregnant." The silence that followed was deafening. Lauren blinked, as if trying to process what she'd heard. "You have a son?" she asked, her voice trembling, a mix of shock and hurt. James nodded, unable to meet her eyes. "Yes, a son I never knew, Nathan. He's 39, a doctor, and he has kids. My grandkids." Each word was a stone cast against the future he'd planned with Lauren, and he could see the cracks forming in her expression. "Why didn't you ever tell me?" she asked, her voice rising, heavy with a pain he hadn't anticipated. 2 years, James. 2 years together, and you never mentioned this. And now what? You're going after this son? This woman? She stood, crossing her arms, her body taut like a wire about to snap. James wanted to reach for her, to soothe her, but he knew he had no right. "I don't know what I'm going to do," he admitted, his voice breaking. "I just found out. But I know I can't pretend this doesn't exist. I need to fix what I did." Lauren laughed, a short, bitter sound that echoed Margaret's in the store. "Fix? After 40 years? And where does that leave me, James? Am I just, what, a backup plan?" Her words cut deep, and James felt the weight of the injustice he'd done her. "That's not it," he said, standing, desperate to explain. "You're everything to me, Lauren. But I can't ignore what I did. I can't ignore him. She turned, her eyes shining with tears she fought to hold back. You can't ignore him, but you can ignore what we have? Are you choosing her over me? She asked, her voice shaking. I thought we were building something, James. A future. And now you tell me about a past you never shared. A son, a woman. She stopped, taking a deep breath. I need time to think. And it sounds like you do too. Lauren grabbed her bag and left, slamming the door. James stood frozen, his heart pounding, unable to move. He'd feared this moment, but nothing had prepared him for the pain of seeing her so hurt. He wanted to run after her, but his legs felt like lead. He knew she was right. He'd hidden a vital part of himself, and now the truth was tearing everything apart. That night James didn't sleep. He sat in the dark, staring at the city lights, their flicker like distant stars. Nathan's image, a man he'd never met, blended with Margaret's strength and pain, and Lauren's betrayed trust. But now, each time he closed his eyes, he saw Margaret's face, heard her words. I told him you were dead. And he saw Nathan, a stranger with his blood, living a life he'd never been part of. By morning, James made a decision. He couldn't move forward with the engagement, not while his past remained an open wound. He needed to face Margaret, Nathan, and the truth he'd fled for so long. But the thought of losing Lauren, of hurting her more, was a burden he could barely bear. He picked up the phone and dialed her number, but it went to voicemail. Lauren, please call me back. We need to talk, he said, his voice thick with emotion. When he hung up, the emptiness was overwhelming. He was caught between two worlds, the future he'd planned and the past he could never erase. And for the first time in his life, James didn't know which path to choose. The sun filtered through the office blinds, casting long shadows across the desk, where James had spent hours reviewing contracts that now seemed trivial. The scent of fresh coffee lingered, but the mug on his desk sat untouched, cooling like the plans he'd made for his life. Since his talk with Lauren 2 days earlier, the silence between them was almost tangible. She hadn't returned his calls, and the voicemail he'd left echoed in his mind as a reminder of his failure to fix things. He knew he'd hurt her deeply, but he also knew he couldn't move forward without confronting the past Margaret had brought to light. Nathan, his son. The name still felt foreign, but it carried a weight he could no longer ignore. James stood, walking to the window overlooking Elliott Bay. The skyscrapers gleamed in the morning light, a testament to his ambition, but now he saw only the emptiness of a life built on wrong choices. He needed to talk to Margaret again, to convince her to let him into Nathan's life. But how? How do you persuade a woman who'd carried the burden of 40 years of abandonment alone? He grabbed his coat and drove to the jewelry store, his heart pounding with a mix of determination and fear. The bell chimed as he entered, and the sparkle of diamonds in the cases seemed to mock his vulnerability. Margaret was there behind the counter, adjusting a display of earrings with the precision of someone who ruled her domain. When she saw him, her eyes narrowed briefly, but she quickly composed herself. James, she said, her voice steady but tinged with weariness. You're persistent, I'll give you that. He took a deep breath, feeling the moment's weight. Margaret, I need to talk to you. Not about rings, not about the past. About Nathan. The name came out with an unconscious reverence, and he saw her body stiffen, as if he'd touched a still raw wound. She crossed her arms, a defensive gesture, but didn't interrupt. I know I have no right to ask for anything, he continued, his voice breaking. But I can't live knowing he's out there, my son, and I never even tried to reach him. Please help me meet him. I know I messed up, he said, his hands raised, pleading. I know nothing I do can erase what I did. But I want to try, Margaret. I want to ask for his forgiveness even if he never accepts me. Please give me that chance. Margaret looked away, her fingers tapping lightly on the counter, as if holding back a storm within. You don't understand what you're asking, she said finally. Nathan has a life, he's happy, he has a wife, kids, a career, and I lied to him his whole life. How do you think he'll feel when he learns I hid the truth, that his father's alive walking around while he grew up without you? James felt a tear slide down his cheek, but he didn't wipe it away. I don't want to hurt him, he said, his voice broken. But he deserves the truth, and I deserve to bear the weight of what I did. I can't run from this anymore, Margaret. And I think, deep down, you don't want to either. He paused, searching her eyes. You're strong, Margaret. Stronger than I'll ever be. But you don't have to carry this secret alone anymore. For a moment, the silence between them was suffocating. Then Margaret took a deep breath, as if making a decision that terrified her. You're asking a lot, James, she said, her voice barely a whisper. But maybe you're right. Nathan deserves the truth. But don't think this will be easy. For any of us. She picked up a business card from the counter and scribbled something on the back. This is the address of the hospital where he works. But I'm coming with you. I won't let you walk into his life without me there to explain. James took the card with trembling hands, his heart racing. He looked at the address, feeling the weight of a moment that could change everything. Thank you, he murmured, his voice thick. I promise I'll do this right. For him. For you. Margaret nodded, but didn't smile. Don't make promises you can't keep, James, she said, turning to organize the display, her movements precise but heavy with emotion. He left the store clutching the card, his heart torn between hope and fear. He knew meeting Nathan would be the greatest challenge of his life, but also the only path to peace. That night he tried calling Lauren again, but it went to voicemail as before. He left another message, his voice heavy with emotion. Lauren, I know I hurt you, but I'm trying to make things right. Please give me a chance to explain. He hung up, feeling an emptiness he couldn't name. He was about to face his past, but at what cost to his future? The next day, James met Margaret at the entrance of a sleek hospital, its glass windows reflecting the clear Seattle sky. She wore a beige coat, her face tense but resolute. You ready for this? She asked, her eyes locked on his. James nodded, but the truth was he'd never been less ready for anything. They walked inside together, their footsteps echoing in the white corridors, each carrying the weight of 40 years of silence. When they reached Nathan's office, Margaret hesitated, her hand hovering over the door. He doesn't know we're here, she said, her voice trembling. But he deserves the truth. She knocked, and a man opened the door, tall, with strong features and eyes like Margaret's. Nathan. James felt the air leave his lungs. Mom, Nathan said, frowning at Margaret. What's going on? Then his eyes fell on James and a shadow of confusion crossed his face. Margaret took a deep breath, her hands clutching her purse. Nathan, we need to talk. I know this isn't the best place, but it had to be now. And it had to be when you were alone, she said, her voice steady but thick with emotion. This is your father. The silence that followed was like thunder. Nathan looked from Margaret to James, his eyes wide, his face pale. My father? He repeated, his voice shaking. You said he was dead. The hurt in his voice was like a blade, and James felt the weight of every year he'd lost. He wanted to speak, to explain, but the words died in his throat. Nathan turned to Margaret, his eyes blazing with angry tears. You lied to me? All these years you lied. Margaret opened her mouth, but no words came. She looked at James, as if asking for help, and he finally found his voice. Nathan, I'm the one to blame, he said, his voice breaking. I left your mother when she was pregnant. I was a coward. But I'm here now, and I want to ask for your forgiveness, even if I don't deserve it. He paused, his eyes fixed on the son he'd never known. I want to know you, to be part of your life if you'll let me. Nathan stood still, his chest heaving with heavy breaths. You think you can just show up now? He asked, his voice thick with pain. After 40 years, I have a family, a life, and you're not part of it. He turned to Margaret, his eyes full of hurt. Why, Mom? Why did you bring him here? Margaret took a deep breath, a tear rolling down her cheek. Because you deserve the truth, my son, she said, her voice breaking. I protected you for so long, but now it's time to face the past. She looked at James, and he saw for the first time a spark of forgiveness in her eyes. But Nathan shook his head, stepping back. I need time, he said, his voice hoarse. I don't know what to do with this. He closed the door, leaving Margaret and James in the corridor, the silence heavier than ever. James looked at Margaret, his heart shattered. I did this wrong, didn't I? He asked, his voice trembling. She sighed, wiping away her tear. "No, James. You did what you had to do. Now it's up to him to decide." She turned, walking toward the exit, and James followed, feeling the weight of an uncertain future. He'd found his son, but at what cost? The soft autumn breeze drifted through the open windows of James's condo, carrying the scent of fallen leaves dancing in the streets below. He sat at the dining table, a cold coffee mug forgotten before him, as he flipped through an album of photos Margaret had given him days after the hospital encounter. They were images of Nathan, a curly-haired boy running in a park, a proud teenager with a science fair medal, a young doctor accepting his diploma with a world-lighting smile. Each photo was a reminder of the time James had lost, but also a promise that there might still be room to build something new. 6 months had passed since that confrontation in Nathan's office, and though the road had been rough, James felt for the first time that he was on the right path. The past months had been a test of patience and humility. Nathan, initially furious at the revelation, had refused to speak to James. But Margaret, with her quiet strength, mediated, insisting Nathan at least hear his father out. Slowly, in short, tense meetings, Nathan began sharing pieces of his life, stories of his kids, his wife, his passion for saving lives. James listened with reverence, knowing each word was a gift he didn't deserve. He also met his grandchildren, Mia and Oliver, 2 bright-eyed kids who called him Grandpa, with a natural ease that made him cry when he was alone. Each moment with them was redemption, a piece of his soul reclaimed. During that time, Lauren had vanished. James had waited weeks for a response to his messages, but she stayed silent. Finally, after persistent calls, he met her at a coffee shop where she agreed to talk. "I love you, James," she said, tears in her eyes, "but I can't live in the shadow of your past." He nodded, heart broken, knowing she was right. To ease the pain he'd caused, he offered to let her keep the condo he'd been paying for and gifted her a car to help with her studies and new start. Lauren accepted with dignity, knowing the car and rent-free home would make a difference. She'd given up everything to live his life, traveling, attending events, socializing, and now she needed to rebuild. She stood, wishing him well, and left. The goodbye was clean but left a scar. Since that conversation, James devoted himself to rebuilding with Nathan and Margaret. It wasn't easy or quick, but with persistent effort, he began earning trust. Eventually, they started spending time together as a family. James tried to rekindle things with Margaret, but she held firm as long as she could. Occasionally, after work, he'd take Margaret for coffee, their talks blending memories with heavy silences. He learned that despite her strength, she still carried pain, but also a love time hadn't erased. Slowly, their meetings grew more frequent, their smiles more genuine. James was surprised by how she made him laugh, as if the 40 years apart were just a pause in a story that never ended. He knew he couldn't rush her, that each step had to be earned with patience and respect. Weeks later, on an ordinary morning, James felt a new restlessness. He'd planned something special, something to seal the final chapter of his journey. He called Margaret, inviting her to dinner at the restaurant where, 40 years ago, they dreamed of a future together. "It's a surprise," he said, his voice thick with emotion. Margaret laughed, a sound that still made his heart race. "You and your surprises, James. Fine, I'll come." The restaurant was a cozy spot, with flickering candles on tables and a view of the waterfront reflecting Seattle's lights. James arrived early, adjusting his tie nervously. He'd chosen a table by the window, the same one where in their youth they'd shared dessert and vows of eternal love. When Margaret walked in, wearing a red dress that highlighted her elegance, James felt breathless. She smiled, a soft glow in her eyes, and sat down. "You're mysterious tonight," she teased. "What's up your sleeve?" James took a deep breath, feeling the moment's weight. "Margaret, these past months have been like a miracle," he began, his voice shaking. "I know I can't change the past, but you've given me a chance to build something new, with Nathan, our grandkids, and, I hope, with you." He paused, reaching for her hands across the table. "I loved you my whole life, even when I was fool enough to run, and now I want to do things right." Margaret's brow furrowed, a mix of curiosity and emotion crossing her face. James pulled a small wooden box from his pocket, hand-carved by a local artisan. He opened it, revealing a simple ring with a modest diamond framed by delicate details. "This isn't the ring I went to buy that day," he said, his eyes shining. "That was for a future I thought I wanted. This is for us, for the life we should have had, and the one we can still build. Margaret, will you marry me?" The silence that followed felt like forever. Margaret looked at the ring, then at James, her eyes brimming with tears. "James," she murmured, her voice breaking, "after everything, you still believe in us?" He nodded, a tear rolling down his cheek. "More than ever. I know I don't deserve it, but I want to spend the rest of my life proving I do." Margaret took a deep breath, a trembling smile on her lips. "You're crazy, James," she said, laughing through tears. "But so am I. And, yes, I will." She extended her hand, and he slipped the ring onto her finger, feeling the world finally align. They embraced, their warmth erasing 40 years of scars. Months later, the church where James and Margaret should have wed 40 years ago was filled with white flowers and lights dancing on stone walls. Nathan walked Margaret down the aisle, his eyes shining with pride and emotion. He'd slowly come to accept James, though their bond was still a work in progress. Mia and Oliver, the grandkids, tossed rose petals, giggling with childish energy that brightened everything. James, waiting at the altar, felt his heart so full he could barely breathe. When Margaret reached him, in an ivory dress that seemed woven from light, he took her hand, knowing he was finally home. The ceremony was simple, but every word carried weight. Nathan gave a speech, his voice trembling. "For a long time I thought my story was incomplete, but today I see it's made of love, forgiveness, and second chances." He looked at James, then Margaret, and smiled. "Welcome to the family, Dad." The word "Dad" was a gift, and James wept openly, hugging his son with a strength that said everything. The celebration spilled into the church garden, with music, laughter, and dancing. James and Margaret opened the dance floor, swaying under the stars as they dreamed in their youth. He looked at her, at the ring glinting on her hand, and felt a peace he'd never known. "We did it, Margaret," he whispered, as they turned slowly. She smiled, resting her head on his shoulder. "Yes, love. And now we have the rest of our lives to live." But there was one final surprise, one even Margaret didn't expect. During the reception, Nathan called for attention, raising a glass of champagne. "A special toast," he said, his voice steady but warm with emotion. "To my mother who gave me everything, and to my father who came back to share it. And I want to announce that in honor of this day, my wife and I have decided to name our new daughter, due in a few months, Margaret." The crowd gasped, moved, as Margaret covered her face, sobbing with joy. James hugged Nathan, feeling this gesture was the final tie binding their family. As the night wore on, James looked at his family, Margaret, Nathan, the grandkids, the promise of a new life, and knew he'd found what he'd always sought. The past couldn't be erased, but it could be transformed into something beautiful, built on love, forgiveness, and redemption. And under the stars he vowed to himself never to run from what mattered again. Remember, it's never too late to face the past and rewrite your story with love and forgiveness. If you were moved by this journey, leave a like, subscribe to the channel to follow more inspiring stories like this one, and don't forget to watch the next video that appears on your screen now.